Ladies and gentlemen, the United States of America is standing at a moment of profound strain. Across multiple regions of the world, American military forces are engaged, American resources are stretched, and American attention is divided. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East, from the Indo-Pacific to global counterterrorism operations, the United States is facing a reality that many warned about but few believed would arrive so quickly. Tonight, the question is no longer whether America is involved in too many conflicts. The question is whether the cumulative weight of these wars, commitments, and crises has pushed the nation to a breaking point. This is AmeriCorps News, and welcome to the channel. We bring you clear, fact-based analysis of the most important stories shaping the United States and the world. If you value serious reporting and long-form context, like this video, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and share this report so others can stay informed during this critical moment in global affairs. America today finds itself operating in a strategic environment unlike any it has faced since the end of the Cold War. Unlike past eras, there is no single dominant conflict, no clearly defined front line, and no universally agreed upon end state. Instead, there is a growing web of overlapping wars, proxy conflicts, security guarantees, and geopolitical obligations that pull U.S. power in multiple directions at once. In Eastern Europe, the United States is deeply involved in supporting Ukraine against Russia. While American troops are not directly fighting on the battlefield, U.S. weapons, intelligence, training, and financial assistance have been essential to Ukraine's ability to continue resisting Russian forces. Billions of dollars in military aid have already been committed, with more approved or under consideration. This support has strategic value, but it also represents a long-term commitment with no clear timeline for resolution. At the same time, the Middle East remains volatile. U.S. forces are stationed across Iraq, Syria, the Persian Gulf, and surrounding regions. They are tasked with counterterrorism operations, protecting regional partners, and deterring hostile state and non-state actors. Recent escalations, including attacks on shipping lanes, drone strikes on U.S. positions, and the sinking of a U.S. Navy destroyer in active combat, have underscored how fragile the situation has become. In the Indo-Pacific, the United States is focused on deterring China and maintaining stability around Taiwan. This is not a symbolic mission. It requires constant naval patrols, air deployments, joint exercises with allies, and a steady flow of military resources into the region. Any miscalculation here could trigger a conflict far larger than anything the U.S. has faced in decades. Beyond these headline theaters, the United States is also engaged in counterterrorism operations in parts of Africa, maintaining security commitments to NATO allies, supporting Israel's defense, and preparing for cyber and space-based threats that did not exist at this scale in previous generations. Each mission may be justified on its own terms, but together they form a level of global engagement that is increasingly difficult to sustain. This is where the concept of strategic overextension comes into focus. History shows that even the most powerful nations can reach a point where commitments exceed capacity. Military strength is not just about weapons and troops. It is about logistics, readiness, morale, industrial production, political unity, and public support. When too many demands are placed on these systems at once, cracks begin to form. Within the United States, those cracks are becoming visible. Defense spending is at historically high levels, yet military leaders warn of ammunition shortages, maintenance backlogs, and recruitment challenges. The defense industrial base is struggling to produce weapons at the pace required for prolonged high-intensity conflicts. At the same time, inflation, national debt, and domestic priorities compete for the same resources. Public opinion reflects this tension. Polls show growing skepticism about endless foreign commitments, particularly when outcomes appear uncertain. Many Americans support allies and global stability in principle, but they are increasingly concerned about the cost, the duration, and the risk of escalation. These concerns are amplified during election cycles, where foreign policy becomes entangled with domestic political divisions. Allies, too, are watching closely, nations that rely on U.S. security guarantees are reassessing how dependable and sustainable those guarantees will be in the long term. Some are increasing their own defense spending, while others are hedging by strengthening regional partnerships. Adversaries, meanwhile, are testing limits, probing for weaknesses, and exploiting moments of distraction. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that these conflicts are not isolated. Actions in one theater can trigger reactions in another. A major escalation in the Middle East can affect energy markets worldwide, fueling inflation and economic instability. A prolonged war in Europe drains resources that might otherwise be used in the Indo-Pacific. A crisis involving Taiwan would demand an enormous concentration of U.S. military power, potentially leaving other regions exposed. The title of this report reflects a growing concern among strategists and policymakers. America is already in too many wars, and the margin for error is shrinking. The breaking point does not arrive suddenly with a single decision. It builds gradually, through accumulated strain, miscalculation, and overconfidence. In the next part of this report, we will examine how the United States reached this position, how post-Cold War assumptions shaped current strategy, and why the global environment has become more hostile at the same time America's room to maneuver has narrowed. To understand why the United States finds itself under such strain today, it is necessary to look back at the period following the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. For a brief moment in history, there was a widespread belief among American leaders that large-scale conflict between major powers was no longer inevitable. The dominant assumption was that economic integration, globalization, and liberal democratic norms would gradually reduce the likelihood of war. This assumption shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. America expanded its global military footprint, not as a response to existential threats, but as a stabilizing force meant to deter conflict before it began. Bases were maintained across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Alliances were expanded. Security guarantees were offered. The idea was simple. American presence would prevent instability, and American power would discourage aggression. However, this strategy came with a hidden cost. By positioning itself as the ultimate guarantor of global security, the United States gradually assumed responsibility for crises far beyond its immediate national defense. What began as selective engagement slowly evolved into permanent involvement. The attacks of September 11 accelerated this process dramatically. The United States entered Afghanistan with overwhelming public support and a clear objective: dismantle terrorist networks and prevent future attacks. Soon after, the war in Iraq opened another front. These conflicts consumed enormous resources, both human and financial, and reshaped the U.S. military around counterinsurgency and long-term deployments. Even as these wars dragged on, new challenges emerged. China's rapid economic and military rise began to challenge U.S. dominance in Asia. Russia, weakened in the 1990s, began reasserting itself on the global stage. Iran expanded its influence through regional proxies. Non-state actors gained access to technologies that once belonged only to major militaries. Instead of replacing old commitments with new priorities, the United States layered them on top of one another. Counterterrorism operations continued, even as focus shifted to great power competition. Troops were withdrawn from some areas, only to be redeployed elsewhere. The result was not disengagement, but redistribution. This layered strategy has created a constant state of readiness. U.S. forces today are expected to deter Russia, contain China, counter Iran, fight terrorism, defend allies, secure global trade routes, and prepare for cyber and space warfare simultaneously. No previous generation of American policymakers attempted to sustain this level of global responsibility indefinitely. Military planners have long warned that readiness is not infinite. Equipment wears down. Training cycles are disrupted by frequent deployments. Experienced personnel leave the service faster than they can be replaced. Recruitment has become more difficult as fewer young Americans meet eligibility standards or express interest in military careers. The industrial side of warfare is also under pressure. Modern conflicts consume vast quantities of precision weapons, ammunition, and replacement parts. Production lines that were designed for peacetime efficiency struggle to scale up during prolonged crises. Stockpiles that once seemed sufficient are now being depleted faster than they can be replenished. These material constraints intersect with political realities. In Washington, consensus on foreign policy has become harder to achieve. Support for overseas engagement increasingly depends on partisan alignment rather than long-term strategic vision. Funding packages face delays. messaging becomes inconsistent. Adversaries pay close attention to these signals. At the same time, global rivals have adapted. Instead of confronting the United States directly, they employ strategies designed to exploit American overextension. Proxy forces, cyber operations, economic pressure, and information warfare allow them to challenge U.S. interests without triggering a full-scale response. This approach creates a dilemma. Each individual provocation may seem too small to justify a major military action, yet the cumulative effect steadily erodes deterrence. Over time, boundaries are tested, red lines blur, and the risk of miscalculation grows. The American public experiences this not as a single war, but as a constant background of crisis. News cycles shift rapidly from one region to another. There is rarely a sense of resolution, only escalation or stalemate. This contributes to fatigue, skepticism, and declining trust in leadership. Meanwhile, allies depend heavily on U.S. involvement, but also worry about its sustainability. Some fear abandonment. Others fear entrapment, being drawn into conflicts not of their choosing. Managing these relationships requires diplomatic effort and military presence, further stretching limited attention and resources. All of this brings the United States closer to a strategic threshold, not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual loss of flexibility. When too many commitments exist, leaders have fewer good options during crises. Every decision carries higher risk, and every mistake has wider consequences. In the next part of this report, we will examine how current conflicts intersect with one another, why escalation risks are increasing, and how a single unexpected event could push the United States from strain into genuine strategic crisis. The danger of the current moment lies not only in the number of conflicts the United States is involved in, but in how tightly those conflicts are now interconnected. In previous eras, wars could often be compartmentalized. A crisis in one region did not automatically trigger instability elsewhere. Today, that separation no longer exists. Economic systems, military alliances, energy markets, and information networks bind global events together in ways that amplify risk. Consider how escalation works in the modern environment. A strike in the Middle East can disrupt shipping lanes, drive up oil prices, and fuel inflation across the United States and Europe. Rising prices then affect domestic politics, weaken public support for foreign commitments, and constrain policymakers. Adversaries watch these reactions carefully, learning how pressure in one domain creates vulnerability in another. The same dynamic exists in Europe. Support for Ukraine has strategic importance, but it also consumes weapons, ammunition, and financial resources at a pace that was not anticipated when the conflict began. These resources are finite. Every artillery, shell, missile, or air defense system sent to one theater is unavailable for another. Military planners must constantly balance immediate needs against long-term preparedness. In the Indo-Pacific, the stakes are even higher. Any major crisis involving Taiwan would require an enormous concentration of U.S. naval and air power. Carrier strike groups, submarines, logistics ships, and air assets would be pulled toward a single region. That shift would inevitably leave gaps elsewhere, inviting opportunistic actions by adversaries who understand the limits of American capacity. This is why analysts increasingly describe the current situation as one of cumulative escalation risk. No single conflict may trigger a global war on its own, but the interaction between them raises the probability that a local crisis spirals beyond control. Misinterpretation, miscalculation, or technical failure could force decisions to be made under extreme pressure. Another factor intensifying this risk is the speed of modern warfare. Hypersonic weapons, cyber attacks, and automated systems compress decision timelines. Leaders may have minutes, not days, to assess threats and respond. When forces are already stretched thin, the margin for error shrinks even further. Domestic pressures compound the challenge. The United States is deeply polarized, and foreign policy debates often become proxies for broader political struggles. This polarization affects everything from budget approvals to strategic messaging. Allies notice hesitation. Adversaries perceive opportunity. At the same time, economic constraints are tightening. High levels of national debt limit fiscal flexibility. Inflation makes large spending packages politically sensitive. Voters increasingly ask what tangible benefits global engagement brings to their daily lives. These questions do not imply isolationism, but they do demand clearer justification for sustained overseas commitments. The military itself feels the strain. Service members rotate through deployments with little time for recovery. Families bear the burden of uncertainty. Retention challenges grow as experienced personnel weigh long-term stress against civilian opportunities. Morale, an intangible but critical component of military effectiveness, becomes harder to sustain under constant pressure. Strategic rivals have adapted their doctrines accordingly. Instead of seeking decisive battles, they aim to exhaust. They apply pressure across multiple fronts, knowing the United States must respond somewhere, even if not everywhere. This approach is patient, incremental, and difficult to counter without escalation. Information warfare plays a role as well. Narratives about American decline, overreach, or hypocrisy are amplified online. These narratives are designed not only to influence foreign audiences, but to deepen divisions within the United States itself. Confidence erodes, trust weakens, strategic coherence suffers. None of this means the United States is powerless. It remains the world's most capable military and one of its most influential economies. But power is relative, and effectiveness depends on how it is applied. When commitments outpace capacity, even strong systems can become brittle. The central question is whether current policies acknowledge this reality. Are priorities being set clearly, or are they accumulating by default? Are commitments aligned with resources, or sustained through inertia? These are uncomfortable questions, but avoiding them increases the risk of abrupt crisis. In the next part of this report, we will examine potential paths forward. We will explore what strategic recalibration could look like, what risks come with retrenchment or escalation, and whether the United States can reduce strain without undermining global stability. As the United States confronts this moment of accumulated strain, the discussion increasingly turns toward what recalibration might actually mean in practice. Strategic recalibration does not necessarily imply withdrawal or abandonment of allies. Rather, it requires a clear hierarchy of priorities and a realistic assessment of what can be sustained over time. One possible path forward involves narrowing the scope of U.S. commitments. This would mean distinguishing between interests that are vital to national survival and those that, while important, do not justify indefinite military engagement. Such distinctions are politically difficult, but without them, strategy becomes reactive rather than deliberate. Another approach focuses on burden sharing. The United States has long encouraged allies to take greater responsibility for their own defense, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia. Recent increases in defense spending by allied nations suggest some progress, but integration and coordination take time. Until allies can fully shoulder these roles, the United States remains deeply involved. There is also the question of deterrence versus escalation. Strong deterrence requires credible capability and clear signaling, but excessive signaling can harden positions and reduce diplomatic flexibility. Striking the right balance is one of the most difficult challenges in statecraft, especially when adversaries interpret restraint as weakness and action as provocation. Economic tools are increasingly part of this equation. Sanctions, trade controls, and supply chain policies are now used alongside military measures. While these tools can impose significant pressure, they also carry costs for the global economy and for American consumers. Overuse risks diminishing their effectiveness. Technology further complicates the picture. Advances in artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and cyber capabilities offer new ways to project power without large troop deployments. At the same time, they introduce new vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or financial systems could have effects comparable to traditional military strikes, blurring the line between war and peace. Public consent remains a central factor. In democratic systems, sustained engagement abroad depends on public understanding and support. When strategies are unclear or goals appear unattainable, that support erodes. Leaders must articulate not only what the United States is doing, but why it is doing it, and what success would look like. Failure to address these questions increases the risk of sudden crisis-driven decisions. History shows that nations under prolonged strain are more likely to make choices under pressure rather than through careful planning. Such decisions tend to carry higher costs and unintended consequences. The concept of a breaking point is not about collapse, but about inflection. It is the moment when incremental adjustments are no longer sufficient and fundamental choices must be made. For the United States, that moment may be approaching. Whether this leads to renewed strategic clarity or deeper entanglement depends on decisions made now. Choices about where to engage, where to lead diplomatically, and where to step back will shape not only American power, but global stability. The world remains highly interconnected. A reduced U.S. role in one area will not eliminate conflict, but it may change who bears the burden and how risks are distributed. Conversely, maintaining the current level of engagement without adjustment may preserve influence in the short term while increasing vulnerability in the long term. As policymakers debate these options, time continues to pass, conflicts evolve, alliances shift, technologies advance. The window for deliberate recalibration narrows with each new crisis. This is why the question posed by this report matters. America is already involved in too many wars and too many commitments to treat each challenge in isolation. The breaking point is not a single event, but the cumulative effect of choices made over decades. Whether the United States can navigate this moment without a major strategic failure will depend on its ability to align means with ends, power with purpose, and ambition with reality. AmeriCorps News will continue to examine these issues closely, providing analysis grounded in facts and focused on the long-term implications for the United States and the world.